I have long since lost the ability to speak. But what I would like to do in thinking, I'm dying, and I'm sitting here, and I'm thinking about Julia and my children. People don't know what I'm thinking. I can't speak. But I would like to think with my friends. I'd like to think out loud and let you know what I'm thinking as I sit here on this porch and at my last days. This can't last long. I can't last much longer. The pain is awful. It's agony, and I can't last. The end will be welcomed, but I've got to hold on. I held on until I finished the memoirs. I wrote another 50 pages that I did not plan to write because I rallied. I came here at Mount McGregor Cottage, at the Drexel Cottage, and I was able, with this night air, I was able to revive. And I added those 50 pages. I can't write anymore. I'm done. I have persevered, and I've written enough of a book, 2 volumes, to care for Julia. My Julia, I had nothing to leave her. I was broke, in debt heavily, and now I have written something that I hope people will like. I hope they will buy it. Mr. Twain may profit, and I may provide for my Julia. In writing that book, and I wrote it essentially from last November of '84 to now July the 19th of '85. I just had my 63rd birthday. I have done much in my life, and all of it is so unlikely. I should never have been able to do what I have done. I knew from August of '84, when I bit into that peach at our home at Long Branch, and I thought a wasp had stung me, that I swallowed. It hurt so badly. I saw the doctor in weeks later. Of course, I ignored Julia's entreaties to go to the doctor. I thought, bah, nothing to it. By the time I went to the doctor, I saw the look in his eyes, and he referred me to another doctor. And I will not go through all the names, the litany of names of the physicians who attended me, although they are all wonderful men. And I knew it was cancer. And I told the doctor, tell me, do not shade it or color it. Tell me, it's cancer, isn't it? And he said, yes, it is, General, and I fear inoperable. And that was a death sentence, and I knew it. And he said, you will have a terrible and agonizing few months until you die. I know not how long you've got. And I was heavily in debt. Grant and Ward had collapsed. My family had all invested. Many people were in debt because of their investments with me. I had gone from a millionaire to a pauper in one day. I don't know how I could have misjudged that man Ward as badly as I did. I've known all my life, I have been known all my life to trust men far past when I should have trusted them, when indeed they'd betrayed my trust. But I had no reason to mistrust Ward. And he he took everything I had, everything Julia and I had, everything my family had. And I had no pension because I had resigned from the Army when I took the presidency. I could have retired. But if I'd retired, and perhaps you do not know this, but if I'd retired, I would have left. I'd have been on the list as the general of the Army. It would have blocked another man from going up in the ranks. That's why I resigned. I was cautioned at that time, don't do this. If you resign, you will lose your pension. But I was thinking of my fellow officers. And I said, no, I've got to resign. I've got to open the slot. Well, that came back to haunt me when this struck me, and I had no money. Fortunately, Congress, in its wisdom, both Confederate legislators, congressmen and senators who are now in Congress through the Reconstruction, and the Republicans, the federal soldiers, former soldiers, they all came together and approved me being put back on the active list that would assure Julia a pension after my death. I was in so much pain by that time, it really didn't matter, but I knew the import. So Julia, with that bit of money and from the sale of my memoirs, she should be taken care of. Mr. Clemens seems to think they will sell very well indeed, but that remains to be seen. Let me think with you about even back to my childhood. When I was 10 years old, I fell in White Oak Creek there in Georgetown. And in the spring, of course, our parents had told us don't swim in the creek. It's rising from the winter snows melting. And of course, we ignored them. And I was a good swimmer. I jumped in White Oak Creek. It immediately carried me away, and I was drowning. And Daniel Ammon, one of my childhood chums in Georgetown, later Admiral Ammon in the U.S. Navy during the war, and his brother Jake Ammon, later General Ammon under my command. Two other of my childhood friends from that little village of Georgetown, Ohio. They both ran, grabbed a limb, held it out in White Oak Creek and said, "Grab it, Liz, grab it." And I did. And they pulled me out. I should have drowned that day. When I was 17, my father secured for me an appointment to the military academy. He did not tell me he had secured it for me until one evening at dinner in December of '38, when I was 16 years old, about to be 17 in '39. My father looked across the dinner table there in Georgetown. He said, "Liz, I think you've got it." And I was 16 years old. I wasn't expecting anything of moment. I didn't know he'd sought an appointment for me at the United States Military Academy. I thought I'd made it clear I had no interest in the academy, the military. The military life held no charms for me. And he said, "I think you've got it." And I said, "Got what?" As I was eating my supper. And he said, "Why, the appointment to the military academy." And I said, "I won't go." I knew that was the wrong thing to say very quickly. And the room went silent. My 4 siblings, sisters and brothers, there was a 5th sibling under my mother's apron at the end of the table, born after I left for the academy. But the 4 there all leaned over, the better to hear what they knew was going to come. They said, "Liz is going to get it." And my father put down his fork and he said, "I think you will." And by then I'd remembered myself, and I said, "Well, if you think I will, then I think I will." And I was off to the academy. I didn't want to go to the academy. I didn't think I had a good enough education to succeed at the academy. Went into summer camp. Spent that summer there at West Point. Then I took my entrance exam, and I passed the entrance exam on the first attempt, which greatly disappointed me. I wanted to go home with honor. On the way there, I took my first train ride. Went 18 miles an hour. 18 miles an hour. The devil can't go that fast chasing souls. But I did. I took the steamboat. I dawdled. I spent a week in Philadelphia seeing plays. My father rapped my knuckles for being so tardy. I was hoping I'd have an accident on the train or on the boat. Not get hurt, just have an accident that would delay me enough that I wouldn't have to go. No such accident occurred. And I went. I passed. And while I was there, they tried to close the academy. Congress tried to close the military academy. They said, we're going to develop a military elite. We don't need that. We don't need a college dedicated to training the military. It failed. I was disappointed yet again. I resolved myself that I was going to have to stay until I graduated, and I doubted that would ever happen. But it did. I graduated 21st out of 39 classmates. But you should know, we started out with 100. That summer in 1839, there were 100 cadets. There was another U.S. grant in that class, initially from the state of New York. He didn't see fit to stay. We started with 76 in the fall of 39. We graduated that 39 in the summer of 43. And I was in the Army. I was Brevet Second Lieutenant Ulysses S. Grant. Now, when I went to the academy, I arrived, I was 17 years old. I was 5 feet 1 inch tall. I weighed 117 pounds. I was not impressive. They called me United States Grant, and I was all right with that. They called me Uncle Sam Grant and for a while, and I was all right with that. For a while, they called me the girl because I was 5'1", 117. I was a little slip of a fellow, and my features was as they described, delicate. And they called me the girl. I wasn't all right with that, but that fell away. A tall, red-headed fellow who was a fourth-year man named Sherman either cursed me or blessed me with the Sam Grant, because he said sneeringly, when they were all the fourth-year men were looking at the first-year list, and he said, well, looks like we got ourselves an Uncle Sam Grant. Now, Kemp Sherman has vigorously denied since then he said that, but he did. I always outranked him. He kept denying he said that, but he did. So that my U.S. Army name became my Army issue name, as I fondly think of it, was Ulysses S. Grant, because the man who appointed me didn't know, for various reasons that I won't go into. He thought my name was Ulysses S. Grant. My name is Hiram Ulysses Grant. And to further obfuscate matters, he didn't write Simpson. He wrote Ulysses S. Grant. I wrote my wife, Julia, several times over my lifetime. I have an S in the middle of my name, and I have no idea what it means. My name is not Ulysses Simpson Grant, but that's my Army issue name. My nickname is Sam, so I was born Hiram Ulysses Grant. I became Ulysses S. Grant. I'm called Sam Grant. My family calls me Lisp. People that don't like me call me useless. I have a number of names. But I went into the Mexican War. Well, I met Julia when I went to Jefferson Barracks in St. Louis. And Fred Dent, her brother, had been my roommate one year at the academy, and he said, Liz, if you go to Jefferson Barracks, you should call on my parents at Whitehaven. And I said I would, and I did. And I went about once a week, twice a week. Ellen Dent, Mrs. Dent, liked me, took an instant liking to me. Colonel Dent did not. But I ate well and had a nice time with Ellen and Emma, the two sisters that were still there at home. Emma was just a little thing about 6 years old. She claims me. She said I saw him first. But I went about once a week from September through February, and then Julia came home from finishing school in St. Louis, which is only 8 miles away. And I always wondered, and I asked her, where were you? I was at finishing school. She was living with the O'Fallons in St. Louis, a well-to-do family, good friends. And she said, I was at finishing school. And I said, finishing what? And she said, oh, Liz, go on with yourself. Now, Julia, at that time, was 5 feet, I think 1 inch tall. I had shot up to 5'8". I graduated from the academy at 5'6", so I grew 7 inches. But I had Tyler's grip that last year, a congestive lung ailment, and it like carried me off. And I lost all my weight. So when I graduated, I weighed 117 pounds. I was 5'7", but I weighed 117 pounds. By now I've grown to 5'8". And Julia was 5'1", little slip of a thing too, had the smallest hands of any woman I ever met. And she could ride a horse as well as I could, side saddle in a dress. That chagrined me greatly. But we courted, and I didn't know it, but I was falling in love. I had a temporary assignment away from Jefferson Barracks. Oh, and I had started going to Jefferson Barracks every day. When Julia came back, my weekly visit became a daily visit. And I went to another assignment, and I was absolutely miserable. Miserable. And I didn't know why. And then it occurred to me, I'm in love. I'm in love. When I got back to Jefferson Barracks, I immediately rode my horse Fashion. My father had given it to me as a graduation gift. Beautiful brown horse, long silky mane and tail. I rode Fashion out to Whitehaven, and as soon as I was alone with Julia on the porch there, I asked her to marry me. She turned me down. She didn't want to be, she was evasive, but she said she didn't want to be engaged when the debutante season was coming up in St. Louis that fall. And she said my father wouldn't approve. Well, she teases me and says I badgered her, but she finally agreed, so to speak, to marry me. And I was again sent away for a temporary assignment. My unit, my regiment, was sent to Mexico. And I had a temporary assignment elsewhere. I came back, the regiment's gone. And Dick Ewell, later General Dick Ewell, for the Confederacy. But Dick was at Jefferson Barracks. Says the regiment's gone, and I said, I've got to get out to Whitehaven. I've got to see, well, I've got to get to Whitehaven, Dick. And he said, well, go on out there. He knew what was going on. Everybody knew that what was going on, everybody in the barracks. He said, well, I'll hold on to these orders. You go to Whitehaven and do what you've got to do. And when you come back, you can open these orders. And I said, all right. I went to Whitehaven, and it had been raining, been pouring down, frog drowner rain, maybe 2 frog drowner rain. And Gravois Creek was overflowing. Ordinarily, it's barely a trickle. It was overflowing. But I was a determined young man, and I swam that horse across the creek. Well, the horse nearly drowned, and so did I. I was able to hold on to his bridle. We got on the other side. One of Julia's brothers came up, and I'm soaking wet. And I told him I'm trying to get to Whitehaven. And he lived at Wishton Wish, just about 1.5 miles away. And he said, well, I've got some clothes that you can wear. They won't fit you. He was considerably taller, but I put on his clothes. And I showed up, there at Whitehaven in clothes that didn't fit in pouring rain, and Julia thought I was already gone to Mexico. And she had had a dream the night before that I was going to appear at the house in clothes that didn't fit, soaking wet, and be there knocking on her door. And she had prescient dreams. She had those dreams all our lives together. She had dreamed before every victory that I won that I had won. She knew I'd won before I told her, telegraphed her, wrote her a letter. And she said, I dreamed you'd be here. And I pressed my suit with her, and she finally accepted. We were going to a wedding at that time, and going back across that same Gravois Creek, across the bridge, and I had the buggy. And she was afraid that the horse would bolt and we'd go in the water. And I said, that's all right, Julia, I've got the horse. So we start to go. She grabbed my arm. We went across the creek, and she said, oh, Lieutenant Grant, I think I shall hold on to you forever. And I said, that's a good idea. You should marry me. And she said, all right. And I took off my West Point ring and put it on her finger. And I didn't take it. She didn't take it off until I married her. And she took it off. And I put a wedding ring. And we've had 36 years together. And now I'm dying. But I provided for her, I hope, with the memoirs. But I was off to Mexico after she agreed to marry. And I'm gone almost 4 years. I got back, and I said, we're going to get married. And she said, Father, I won't approve of it. And I went to speak to him. And he said, Colonel Dent, he really wasn't a colonel. All those southern plantation owners call themselves colonel. It's part of that comes with the plantation, I think. And he said, so you want Julia, huh? And I said, yes, sir, I do. And he said, well, if you wanted Ellen, now that'd be okay. And I said, I don't want Ellen. He said, well, if you wanted Emmy, that'd be okay. I don't want Emmy. I said, don't pull a Rachel and Laban switch up on me. I want Julia. And he said, no. And he said, you'll never amount to anything. You'll never be any good. I didn't raise my first daughter to live the Army life. You're just never going to amount to anything. Now, his wife, Ellen, had told Julia and her brothers and sisters that Julia told me, she said, you listen to what I say. That little man, I didn't care much for that part of it, but she said, that little man is going to hold the greatest office in this country. Yes, even the presidency. He's a poet. He's a philosopher. He is a great man. He has not had time to show it. He does not have the maturity to show what he is. But he will be a great man. Julia, if he asks you to marry him, you accept him. And so Mrs. Dent prevailed, I think, with Colonel Dent. And he finally relented. And we got married in August the 22nd, 1848. It was pouring down rain again. In St. Louis, it was steamy hot. We got married in their townhouse on downtown St. Louis, Sherry Street. And all the shutters were closed, and it was like an oven. And Pete Longstreet, who is about 6'4" or 5 inches tall, was standing behind me. Pete Longstreet, David Pratt, Cadmus Wilcox, all of them became Confederate generals. But they all stood up with me when I married Julia. Now, Pete Longstreet, Dutch Longstreet, still teases me and says, I stood behind you, Grant, to keep you from bolting for the door. Well, I had assignments in the Army and went here and there in Michigan. But in July of 1852, I had to go to California. Now, Julia had had one child, and she was heavy with another one, and we were expecting that child any day. When I left, as I recall, on the 5th of July of 1852, and sailed with the 4th Infantry. I was a quartermaster, and we sailed and went to Fort Vancouver in the Oregon Territory. Well, I spent the next 2 years out there, a year at Fort Vancouver, and I was promoted to captain. Captain Bliss had died. Now, it sounds grim, but in the United States Army at that time in 1853, we were all in a lockstep for promotion, and someone had to die before you could move up. Also, we all read the papers out there. We all read the papers. And as early as 53, we knew something was coming. And I felt, even though I was abjectly miserable in the Army, I hated every day of it. I needed to wait until I made full captain in the regular Army, because I just might need that rank later. Well, Captain Bliss died, and in August I got notification from Jefferson Davis, of all people, as you might know, the irony in that, who was then Secretary of War, that I had been promoted to full captain to report to Fort Humboldt, California. Well, I knew Robert C. Buchanan, Lieutenant Colonel Buchanan, from Jefferson Barracks in St. Louis. And all those days that I'd been out to see Julia, coming back to the officers' mess late, Captain Buchanan was a martinet. Lieutenant Buchanan, well, he was captain at that time in St. Louis, was a martinet, and he chastised me in public about being late, finding me a bottle of wine. Well, I wasn't making much money, and I finally one day forgot myself, as I had done with my father earlier, and I said, "Sir, you badger me, you persecute me, and I'll have no more of it." That could have been a court-martial offense, but Captain Buchanan saw fit to let it go. Well, now he's Lieutenant Colonel Buchanan, and he's in command at Fort Humboldt, California, and he was waiting for me. So from September to about December, it took me that long to get out there to Fort Humboldt. I took leave and dawdled. I got there, and on April the 11th of 1854, I got the letter from Jefferson Davis, and it said, "You have been promoted, Captain, United States Army." And I sat down and I wrote the letter, accepting that. Because you don't get the promotion, you don't get the pay until you write out, "I've accepted the commission." And then I immediately wrote another letter resigning from the United States Army. I had been gone. Now, I'd left in July of 52, July the 5th, I believe, of 52. It's now April 11th of 54. My baby was born, Buck was born 3 weeks after I left. Now, he's 2 years old. I have got a baby I haven't seen. He's 2 years old. And every time Julia writes me a letter, and she only writes about 1 to my 4, because Julia, her left eye is crossed almost to her nose with strabismus. And with binocular vision, it's very hard to write or to read. So she doesn't write often, but every time she wrote, she would send me locks of the hair. And if that wasn't bad enough, she would outline the hand of the baby and what's happening every time I get a letter. The hand's getting bigger. I'm missing my babies. I can't stand being on the other side of the continent from my family. So when I made captain, I resigned from the United States Army, and I went home to St. Louis. And I got back with my family. For the next 7 years, I think of it often as being my years in the wilderness, because There are many people who would tell you I was a failure at everything I ever did. I would tell you I just wasn't successful. Until the war started, I nearly did not get back into the war. I got a commission as colonel of the 21st Illinois. And from there, as you may remember, my career went upward until in just 3 years I was appointed the first lieutenant general since George Washington. And we were able to beat Lee, and we brought the Confederates to surrender. And we were countrymen once again. And the healing began, I think. We didn't heal as much as we could have or should have, certainly. I was later, 4 years later, after President Johnson, I was elected president and served 2 terms, and I should like very much to reflect with you about that, but I think I've said quite enough for this time with you. I have sat here on this porch and enjoyed this New York air and wonderful, loving hospitality from everybody here. It's been a great comfort, and it helped me greatly to finish my memoirs.
One 136 years ago, on July 23, 1885, Ulysses S. Grant died at a cottage on Mount McGregor, New York, surrounded by his loving family and faithful caregivers. The following newspaper passage from the New York Times recounts the final hours of the general's life. The general lay on the bed when some member of the family or the doctor or one of the attendants spoke to him. Then he would open his eyes. He could make no other recognition, but that of the eyes was clear. At different times through the night, he made himself understood by some sort of response to questions bearing on his comfort. His last voluntary and irresponsive act of speech, which embodied the idea that governed him in all his sufferings, and which will on that account stand probably as his last utterance, dates back to yesterday afternoon, when noticing the grief that the family could not restrain, he said, whispering in a little above a breath, yet quite distinctly, "I don't want anybody to feel distressed on my account." He was then past rallying to an effort to hide his weakness, but did not forget his solicitude to spare others pain. Reverend Newman stated that Mrs. Grant has been sitting with the general. When she speaks to him, he opens his eyes. She says little and bears up wonderfully. While Mrs. Grant sat by the general, the other members of the family kept either in the other parts of the room or on the porch, almost within whispering call. The rays of the morning sun fell across the cottage porch upon a family waiting only for death. The general lay perfectly still. He was yet conscious. Dr. Douglas and Dr. Schrady remained at the bedside. They saw that the general was sinking, that he could not last long, yet the limit of his endurance could not be fixed. Miss Sartres entered the sick room, and as she stood at the bedside of her father, he opened his eyes. She bent over him, and slipping her hand under his, asked if he could recognize her. She thought she felt a slight pressure from the cold fingers. A change had come. Dr. Schrady sent for the family. The bed stood in the middle of the room. Dr. Douglas drew a chair to the head near the general. Mrs. Grant came in and sat on the opposite side. She clasped gently one of the white hands in her own. When Colonel Fred came in, Dr. Douglas gave up his chair to him. The colonel began to stroke his father's forehead, as was his habit when attending him. Miss Sartres stood at her mother's shoulder, Dr. Schrady a little behind. Jessie Grant leaned against the low headboard, fanning the general. Ulysses Jr. stood at the foot. Dr. Douglas was behind the colonel. The wives of the three sons were grouped near the foot. Harrison was in the doorway, and the nurse Henry near a remote corner. All eyes were intent on the general. His breathing had become soft, though quick. A shade of pallor crept slowly but perceptibly over his features. His bared throat quivered with the quickening breath. The outer air, gently moving, swayed the curtains at an east window. Into the crevice crept a white ray from the sun. It reached across the room like a rod and lighted a picture of Lincoln over the deathbed. The sun did not touch the companion picture, which was of the general. A group of watchers in a shaded room, with only this quivering shaft of pure light, the gaze of all turned on the pillowed occupant of the bed, all knowing that the end had come, and thankful knowing it that no sign of pain attended it. This was the simple setting of the scene. The general made no motion. Only the fluttering throat showed that life remained. The face was one of peace. There was no trace of present suffering. The moments passed in silence. Mrs. Grant still held the general's hand. The colonel still stroked his brow. The light on the portrait of Lincoln was slowly sinking. Presently the general opened his eyes and glanced about him, looking into the faces of all. The glance lingered as it met the tender gaze of his companion. A startled, wavering motion at the throat, a few quiet gasps, a sigh, and the appearance of dropping into a gentle sleep followed. The eyes of affection were still upon him. He lay without emotion. At that instant, the window curtain swayed back in place, shutting out the sunbeam. "At last," said Dr. Schrady in a whisper. "It is all over," sighed Dr. Douglas. Mrs. Grant could not believe it until the colonel, realizing the truth, kneeled at the bedside clasping his father's hand. Then she buried her face in her handkerchief. There was not a sound in the room, no sobbing, no unrestrained show of grief. The example set by him who had gone so quietly kept grief in check at that moment. Reverend Newman entered at the instant of the passing away, looked into the calm face, now beyond suffering, and bowed his head. There was a brief silence. Then Reverend Newman led Mrs. Grant to a lounge, and the others of the family sought their rooms. The general had not been dead 2 minutes when the wires were sending it over the country. It was yet early in the morning when dispatches of condolence and offers of help began to come into the family. The family are bearing the trial well. They were excessively wearied by the long strain. As the end could not be averted, and as the general could be kept alive only in suffering, the family's sorrow seeks comfort in the reflection that death has brought him the only possible relief. It is hard to find consolation with grief yet fresh, but the thought that it has happened for the best has so far averted such violent scenes as had been dreaded. Mrs. Grant is especially brave in her affliction. All have been deeply touched by the many expressions of sympathy from every quarter.
I grew close to the general during my time as his butler over the last 4 years. General Grant was a man who was generous and accepting of all persons, and he always treated me and my family well. The general had good humor. I recall one day I was pulling the general up to the hotel in his wagon. I joked with the general that I felt like a draft horse, to which he scribbled on paper the response. For a man who's been accustomed to drive fast horses, this is a considerable come down in the point of speed. I played along, replying that at least the slower speed was safer. To which the general wrote, "My horse will not run away uphill." We enjoyed a laugh together, and it was good to see the general smile in the midst of his suffering. The general gave me a letter of recommendation during his final illness that I wish to share with you. It's dated June 2nd, 1885. And it's addressed to me, Harrison Terrell. I give you this letter now, not knowing the near future may bring to a person in my condition of health. This is an acknowledgement of your faithful service to me during my sickness up to this time, and which I expect will continue to the end. This is also to state that further, for about 4 years you have lived with me, coming first as my butler, in which capacity you served until my illness became so serious as to require the attention of a nurse. And that in both capacities, I have had abundant reason to be satisfied with your attention, integrity, and efficiency. I hope you may never want for a place. Signed, yours, U.S. Grant. When my son Robert was putting himself through Harvard College, where he graduated last year, the general sent a letter of recommendation to secure him employment. I wish to share the letter he sent to the Boston Custom House. May I request you, as I did last year, to employ R.H. Terrell during vacation in the Boston Custom House. You are aware Terrell is a colored man, now in the senior class at Harvard, and he has to earn his own living while prosecuting his studies. My special interest in him is from the fact that his father, a most estimable man, is my butler. Besides, I should feel an interest in any young man, white or colored, who has had the courage and ability to graduate himself at Harvard without other financial aid than what he could earn. No matter what could be said regarding the general's ways, he was always a man of temperance and in control of his desires. As I have said, he is a generous man to all and has done much for the advancement of my people. Back when he was running for president, the general wrote the following words: "I have no prejudice against sect or race, but want each individual to be judged by his own merit." The great orator and representative of my race, Frederick Douglass, described the general best. Grant was a man too broad for prejudice, too humane to despise the humblest, too great to be small at any point. In him the Negro found a protector, the Indian a friend, a vanquished foe a brother, an imperiled nation a savior. He was more than just an employer. He was my friend. He'll surely be missed.
General Grant commenced writing his book in April 1884, and he intended writing it all himself. After he became very ill in April 1885, he wanted me to be the stenographer. Now, at the time I came to work for the general in April, most of the first volume of the memoirs were already done. This was written almost entirely in his own hand, and only a few corrections were made by him. Very little of the second volume had been written, though he had written some of the Wilderness Campaign in accordance with his arrangement with the Century magazine to write them 4 articles. After I came, that's when he began to dictate. He continued this as long as he was able to do so. As he went on, his voice became weaker and weaker, and toward the last, I had to take my seat very close to his, and he would whisper his words in my ear while I took them down in shorthand. His last dictation was on the 22nd of June, 1885. Now, after this, he would sit and write on his pad on his knee near me, and he would write down his ideas. Sometimes he would doodle. He was very weak, and his hand grew more and more trembling as he neared his death. Now, when I first began, his working hours were from 10 to 12 in the morning. Then in the afternoon, his daughter-in-law, Mrs. Jessie Grant, would read to him out of the books and refresh his memory. And he would sit with his notebook in his hand, and he would take notes. The general had a very good army library, and he knew where to find things. In the evening, he would have more reading, often done by his other daughter-in-law, Ida. And when the family was away, he would sit and think and make more notes. He never dictated at night. He was much too weak. But several of us would look through books to verify dates and little bits of fact. And sometimes Colonel Fred Grant and I would do this together. Now, General Grant dictated very freely, very easily. He made very few changes, and he never hemmed and hawed. Mr. Mark Twain was shown the manuscript of the first volume during one of my dictation sessions with the general. Mr. Twain was astonished when he looked at it. He said that there was not one literary man in 100 who furnished such clean copy as Grant. The general's sentences rarely had to be revised in any way, and it was only in the last few weeks that he did not express himself very well. The dictation for him was painful. His voice got lower and lower as he went on. At last it was just a mere whisper, and then it stopped altogether. I shall never forget his joy at the completion of his book. He was so afraid in his last weeks that he couldn't finish it or revise it. In writing the book, he would use a yellow manila legal pad with blue lines. He would write in pencil. The work tired him very, very much. And at the end, he was only able to scratch down his ideas. I saw at last that he had reached the end. All he could do was wait for death. Now, in July of 1885, we were practically at the end. And I said to Fred Grant, "I think we had better tell your father that the book is done." Colonel Fred Grant then told him. Now, at first, he hardly realized it. Then he was happy for a short period, and he told those around him that his book was finished, and he wanted it all read back to him. The next day, however, he was not so well. He never got to the point where we could read aloud to him, the second volume anyway. It was only a few days after this that he died. Now, during his last days, the general worked almost continually on his book. I saw at the time he was sinking fast and suffering, and he worked all the time to try and ease his discomfort. I was at the cottage at Mount McGregor. My only rest was to take a walk in the woods. Now and again I'd do that. The general spent some of his last days with his daughter Nellie. He seemed to want her near him as much as possible as the end approached. Personally, the general was the most delightful and generous man that I ever knew. He was always cautious in writing or talking so as to not injure the feelings of anyone. I remember many touching incidents when he would cut out sentences he thought might hurt someone, when they might well have been left in. Had he been able and strong, he would have probably made his memoirs complete and comprise his whole life. But as it was, he was glad to be able to finish his military career. It was an honor to be by the general's side during his last days and months. He was as great a private man as he was a general or a civil leader. He was always forgiving and gentle. He was devoted to his sons, who helped verify the facts for his book, and he adored his daughter Nellie. It was a great honor of my life to be permitted to be by his side and aid him in his work.
With the loss of my father-in-law, General Grant, I am attempting to record the pleasant memories of the last 10 years together. Allow me to read what I've recorded on this solemn occasion. I first met the General and Mrs. Grant during my courtship with their son Frederick. I could tell upon my first meeting that the Grants were a warm and loving family, and the General an especially tender man. General and Mrs. Grant came to our Chicago wedding in the fall of '74 as the bud of our romance burst into full bloom. They were delighted with Frederick's choice and welcomed me into the family with open arms and hearts. The General always treated me with the utmost courtesy and familiarity, to the point where I felt fully a part of my new family. Soon after our marriage, Frederick was assigned to military duty in the West, and I consider it one of the greatest privileges of my life to have been invited by the President and Mrs. Grant to stay at the White House with them. It was in this setting that I first truly experienced the joy and love of the Grant family circle. The President treated his children with supreme love and tenderness. He always encouraged them in their studies and in honorable behavior. I remember that his second term was very trying for him, and he relied heavily on us to relieve him from the many cares and pressures it entailed. We would all sit in Mrs. Grant's room in relaxation and pleasant conversation, Fred, Ulysses, Nellie, and the President enjoying his cigar. These were the wonderful, intimate family moments to cherish. After his presidency, the General and Mrs. Grant traveled the world. Even though they stole my Frederick from me for part of their journey, it fazed me not, as their bond was inseparable and true. When they returned, I was showered with gorgeous gifts from abroad, including the most divine dresses I had ever laid my eyes on. It was one of the great adventures of my life to accompany the General and Mrs. Grant on a voyage to Cuba and Mexico, after which we settled into a life in their New York City home for a time. The General said that they were happy as clams at high tide when Frederick and I moved into our Morristown home. Of course, this dwelling was not far from the General's own cottage in Long Branch, a place where the whole family gathered together for many summers. The General always took a keen interest in the lives of my children, Ulysses and Julia, giving them ample attention to satisfy their youthful desires, whether letting them take the reins of his carriage or bringing them into the surf on his shoulders. The General's final illness, as terrible as it has been, has achieved what shared struggles often produce: an even stronger bond of affection, loyalty, and love within our family. As he grew weaker, I aided him by reading passages from the many war books in his library to spur his memory as he struggled to write his memoirs. The General was so very concerned for our welfare to the very last. Just before his death, he told Fred that he had dreamed that I was crying, and supposed it was because he had taken ill from all the stress that these last months of care and devotion had caused him. He was always thinking of us and our lives and futures. This man, who became as true a father as flesh and blood could be, taught me many lessons of life. But perhaps the greatest lesson of all was his incredible devotion to us, his family.